Okay, so today for AP review here, and I realize not everybody's taking the AP test on Thursday. I know some of you are doing it digitally later, but this I'm going to try obviously to record so that you can utilize. This is just a timeline version of trying to remember when things happened, okay, and kind of keep them categorized as best you can. Now I have it color coded for units 2, and this is colonialism up here. Okay, so good old colonialism. And it stretches from 1607 to 1754. So this is Unit 2. All right. 1607. What happens in 1607? Good start. Keep in mind, Unit 1 is before that. Unit 1 is Native American societies and good old Columbus.
Spanish?
Okay, so the Spanish are before that too.
That's where they find Jamestown.
Jamestown. 1607 is Jamestown. Okay?
Wait, Mr. Mayor, I got a question. So, do we come in on Thursday for doing it digitally or no?
You have a regular day of school that day.
Oh,
Okay? Jamestown, 1607. So that is the foundation of what eventually becomes known as Virginia. Okay? The other date to know is 1620. What's the other colonial start that tends to get a lot of play?
slavery.
That happens the year before.
Oh.
1620, another group of people show up.
How about the Pilgrims?
The Pilgrims. 1620 at Plymouth Rock. Again, the Pilgrims who start Massachusetts, and they call it the Massachusetts Bay Colony over time. Okay? Keep in mind, right a year before that, in 1619, that is the start of slavery. So Cam is correct. That previous year, two big things happened in 1619. Slaves show up in Jamestown for the first time, and the House of Burgesses forms, which is the very first form of government. Okay? Very first form of representative government, I should say, amongst the colonies. Okay? The British basically don't tell them not to, so they just assume they have the right to do it. Okay? And they form to handle like small things, like, hey, don't spit on the sidewalk. We don't feel like we have to ask the king for a rule like that. Let's go ahead and set it up here. But because nobody in England says they can't do it, they just assume they have the right to do it, and over time, it becomes so entrenched that anytime the king or parliament say we're not going to follow what you guys want, we get offended. So there are some people out there that will say, some historians will say, that the formation of the House of Burgesses was a very important step towards our independence because we basically just took the right with nobody saying it was okay. Okay? So, that's kind of the early stages of colonies. Now keep in mind, by 1754, how many colonies do we have? 13. Okay? So all throughout this time period, you have the settlement of 13 different colonies, 13 different little societies, all culminating in the 1730s or so with the final one, which was Georgia. Okay? So you're talking about a pretty large time of different colonies kind of forming. Of course, you're going to have Connecticut, you're going to have Rhode Island all split off from Massachusetts Bay. You're going to have the Duke of York sail in and take New York from the Dutch, okay, turn New Amsterdam into New York. You're going to have all these different colonies form, but it all culminates with Georgia in the late 1730s. Okay? Georgia is founded to be a different type of colony. What colony was that founded to do? If Jamestown was founded as a financial colony, you know, they're trying to make money off of it, and Plymouth Rock was founded for religious purposes, what was Georgia founded to do? Not slavery. They did do agriculture eventually, but they were founded as a penal colony. They sent all their prisoners over here. Now, of course, they weren't talking about violent offenders. They were sending over people that owed money. They were sending over people that had huge debts. So it was a debtor's prison. Basically, James Oglethorpe convinces the government of England that it's better to allow somebody that owes money to come over to Georgia and at least attempt to work off their debt than to let them die in a debtor's prison. Okay?
Isn't that just like indentured service?
Very similar concept. Okay? And look, some of these other, you talk about indentured servants. Pennsylvania is formed by Quakers who then use indentured servitude to try and bolster their numbers. Maryland does the same thing. Maryland is founded as a safe haven for Catholics. Pennsylvania, safe haven for Quakers. So those are always key things to remember, that if you get a question on the AP exam that asks about how religion took a role in the early colonies, you know that at least 3 of them were founded specifically for religious reasons. Maryland had the Act of Toleration, basically saying Catholics will have a safe haven, but they're going to allow other people to be there. Okay, Quakers basically said anybody can come to Pennsylvania, it's totally fine. Massachusetts Bay, in 1630, they're going to declare that they are, thanks to James Winthrop, a city upon a hill. Okay, the city upon a hill. So they are the beacon to the rest of the world. This is how colonies should be run. This is how colonies should serve God. Now, that's Winthrop's perception of what colonies are supposed to be. But look, people like Winthrop are going to chase people away. Roger Williams is going to go off and form Rhode Island. There are going to be a whole host of other people that say, hey, we're out, we're going to form Connecticut. So not everybody's on the same page. Okay? Now, during this time period, there are 2 events that you may want to kind of look up and be aware of. England did try and put all 13 colonies into a protective unit from time to time. The major one was when they tried to put New England and New York into what was known as the Dominion of New England. This was a way to try and get the colonies to all kind of work together for mutual protection. But in reality, they put in charge of it a guy that nobody liked, a guy named Sir Edmund Andros. And he kind of went in and said, this is how we're going to do things. And he said, well, that's not how we do it over here. He's like, well, I'm in charge. They're like, who put you in charge? So it was one of the first times that we really were going toe-to-toe with the king. Then we were basically telling the king, the guy you sent over is not somebody we respect. We don't want this guy. So it ended up failing. But this is what allows the colonists later on to say, well, England tried to get us together and unify us. We should have the right to unify on our own terms. That happens later on. Okay? The other thing is in the 1730s, we have the First Great Awakening. That's when a group of preachers kind of point out the fact that we were founded to be a colonial safe haven for Christians, and we've fallen away. We've fallen off the wagon, so to speak, and everybody should turn to God again. Now, of course, where's that really getting its huge push? It's getting its huge push in the northern colonies at that point. So you're talking about New England. I'm going to pause now so that you can have breakfast. Okay, so another thing that we should probably remember at least a little bit is our 13 colonies. Baldwin, give me a colony.
I don't know any of them.
Really?
Oh, flag.
Wow.
Ohio.
New York.
New York. How about this one? Let's go geographically. This is the easiest way to do this, okay? And if I'm going to call somebody on the spot and, I don't know, at 1, this is going to be a little rough. So, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and you have Delaware, Virginia, skip Pennsylvania, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So you will notice in the 13 original colonies, there is no Maine. Maine is a part still of Massachusetts at that point. Vermont Vermont is still a part of New York at that point. Ohio is Indian country. We don't exist. I mean, we do, just not in England. Okay, at least when it comes to that. Florida, still Spanish. Okay, Louisiana, we purchased that later from France. Okay, Kentucky, still Indian territory at that point. So these are the 13 original colonies. Basically the Atlantic seaboard at this point. Okay, those are the 13 original colonies. Starting, of course, with Virginia, then going up to Massachusetts, ending way later with Georgia. Okay, now again, what is the purpose of these colonies all the way through? According to England, the purpose of these colonies is to serve them economically, okay? Which kind of begs a question, what was that system called? Where the parent country uses the colonies to fund them and their economic ambitions. Mercantilism. So yeah, you have to know that that is what the whole purpose is. These 13 colonies are supposed to be making money for the parent country. If they're not making money, they're not worth it, okay? Now, they were worth it enough that in 1754, something happens. What happens in 1754? After a host of smaller conflicts, there's a big one. Specifically from 1754 to 1763. Over here, it was 9 years. Over in England, it was 7.
Oh. Is that the Cold War? Or, that's not the
It's a war.
The 9 Years' War? Or
The
7 years?
French and Indian Wars are the 7 Years' War. So French and Indian War. Okay? 1754 to 1763. An unbelievably misnamed war, because this is a war between the British and the French, and natives are on both sides. The French chose wrong. They were on the side of the smaller tribes, the ones that were from basically the Ohio territory. They ended up on the side of the natives that at first seemed like they were the dominant ones. But the British managed to make friends with the Iroquois League. The Iroquois are dominant in New York, what is today New York, and then up into Canada. So we made, the better friend, if you will, the British do. The colonies are obviously on the side of the British at this point. The problem is not the war itself. We're very proud to be British while we're fighting that war. The problem is that when the war is done, the British make some stupid mistakes. And one of the major ones, in completely misreading the colonies, is they agree in 1763 to a proclamation line. What is the proclamation line?
The Appalachian Mountains.
It's basically the Appalachian Mountains, yes. Basically telling us British settlement will only happen to the east of that. The west of that will be Native American. Okay? So the Iroquois are certainly happy. Hey, they got what they wanted. White guys aren't coming west. The problem is that the British promised that, but the colonists were never consulted, so we continue to go west. We ignore it. Are you supposed to ignore a rule that's laid out by your king? No, but we do it anyway. He's over there, we're over here, he's not coming over here to stop us. Okay? So the proclamation line backfires, and then 2 years later, in 1765, what else do the British do to totally tick us off? Tax. Everybody remember what it was?
Paper tax?
Stamp.
The Stamp Act, right? You're not necessarily wrong. It's on paper for the most part. So the Stamp Act occurs. Okay? Good old 1765. Just 5 years later, we have another step towards revolution. In 1770, that's when the Boston Massacre happens. And in 1773, we have the Boston Tea Party. Keep in mind, this could be a test question. What happens between 1763 and 1773 to turn so many people away? It's a very complex answer. Because in 1754 to 1763, we're all proud British citizens. If somebody asked somebody in Georgia or Massachusetts or anywhere, what nationality are you? They'd say British, and they'd say it very proudly. But from 1763 all the way up into the 1770s, you start seeing this fall apart. The British are not as, they're not on the same page as the colonial minds. We start to splinter. You start getting some people like Sam Adams who declare independence very early in the 1770s. You get people like George Washington who get snubbed by the British military and then decide to join the American Revolution in response to it. You get John Adams, who at first is totally British because he's promoting the policies of Britain and he's defending the British soldiers during the Boston Massacre. And then when the reaction to the Boston Tea Party is to shut down the port of Boston and to shut down the court systems in Boston, that's when John Adams says, you don't have the rights to do that. I'm a British citizen. I have the rights to trial by jury. You're not hauling me back to England to try me over there. I've got a court right here. And so he becomes a revolutionary. So over time, these guys all decide to become revolutionaries. One of the earliest ones is Ben Franklin, because he's over in England, and he gets slighted constantly. And he starts realizing, wait a minute, I'm British, but I'm a second-class citizen in Britain. They don't view me as full British. So if you're not going to view me as a full British citizen, then I am absolutely an American. Okay? So these guys all have their own personal version of conversion to being an American, if you will. Okay? And it all happens in that small time frame. Okay? Now, of course, we fight the Revolutionary War in 1776. We declare our independence officially. And in 1783, we win it. Okay, with the Treaty of Paris. Okay? Just 4 years later, we decide that the government we had formed originally didn't work. And that's when we decided to have a constitutional convention. 2 years later, we ratify it. And you have your first presidency from that point on. So oversimplification, of course. But we're only doing a basic timeline, okay? The thing to remember is that during this time period, from here to here, this is the Articles of Confederation. Our first attempt at a government that failed. Why did it fail? We couldn't tax. You couldn't amend the document without 100% of the states, I should say, saying it's okay. The states all served in a one house or unicameral legislature where every state had a same, one vote, which means if you were the huge state of Virginia, you had the same voting power as Rhode Island, which was highly irritating to Virginians. Okay? So this whole idea of equal vote in the government wasn't exactly popular. They didn't have an executive. They didn't have a national judiciary. There were problems. Now, there were good things, but for the most part, the problems outweighed the positives. So that's why the Constitutional Convention forms in 1787, and again in 1789, they finally ratify it. It becomes the law of the land. That means that you have your first president, George Washington. Okay? George Washington serves from basically 1789 to 1797. He serves 2 terms, setting the precedent. The presidents only serve 2 terms, but there's nothing constitutional that says there's a limit, at least not in that time. Washington has an up and down time as the first president. He has good things that happen, and he has bad things that happen. The good thing, he proves the Constitution works by surviving, if you remember the Whiskey Rebellion. Okay? Only president ever to lead troops. Let him out towards western Pennsylvania to tell the whiskey farmers to knock it off. This means that we survived, whereas the Articles of Confederation never survived Shays' Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion we survived because Washington takes decisive action. At the time, Jay's Treaty was not exactly popular with Great Britain, but we have since learned that that was probably a good thing because we weren't ready to fight a war with Great Britain again, so he delayed what eventually became the War of 1812. He declared a Neutrality Act when the French decide to revolt and have their own revolution and kill their king and kill basically everybody that even remotely comes close to leading and then it results in Napoleon, so it's probably a good thing that we stayed the heck out of it. It wasn't popular at the time as well. So Washington, again, just has kind of a rough presidency, but he shows everybody how the job should work, okay? He gives way to his own vice president, John Adams, and John Adams finishes out the century. He gives way to Thomas Jefferson, who then gives way to Madison and Monroe, okay? In the middle of all that, in 1812, we decide to have a war. It lasts for 3 years. It doesn't go all that well. Our capital city gets burned, but we manage to outlast the British want to fight. The British basically give up. That was the British version of Vietnam right there. They realized they weren't going to win, so they just left. Okay? Keep in mind, prior to that, Thomas Jefferson's crowning achievement, we purchased Louisiana. Okay, so Louisiana Purchase happens in 1803. Monroe's high point is a compromise. In 1820, anybody remember what the compromise was? Missouri Compromise, very good. Or the Compromise of 1820. Okay, Missouri comes in as a slave state, Maine comes in as a free state. And we think we've solved the major problem of our time. We didn't, but they thought they did. Okay, they only really compounded it and made it worse. Who was the architect, by the way, of the Missouri Compromise? He's a guy that comes up on the AP test quite a bit. The great compromiser. 3-time loser for the presidency. A guy named Clay. Henry Clay. Monroe in 1823 issues his Monroe Doctrine, by the way, which is really written by who? Monroe Doctrine, really written by his Secretary of State. Probably our greatest Secretary of State, depending upon your viewpoint of things. Would it help to say he also replaced Monroe as president? And became the first of 2 father-son combinations to ever be president of the United States? Which one? John Quincy Adams. Okay? So JQA takes over later. He, of course, comes in 1824 in a very controversial election. If you remember, that was the election that he ran against Andrew Jackson. Jackson got more votes, but because there were 4 people running, they split the Electoral College where nobody had a majority. So even though Jackson got the most votes, he didn't win the Electoral College. And he went to the House of Representatives, who decided that John Quincy Adams would be president of the United States. And Henry Clay then got to be Secretary of State, and everybody made a big stink about it, including Jackson. A few years later, Jackson ends up becoming president of the United States anyway, and the Jacksonian era begins. Okay? Jackson, of course, has his own little problems with Native Americans. He's got his own little problems with the bank, the National Bank, if you will. He's got his problems with the Southerners, especially his own vice president, a guy by the name of John C. Calhoun, who wants to nullify all the rules, the tariff of abominations, as he called it. And again, that was the closest we ever had to a president actually leading troops again to go down to the South to hang his own vice president. Again, Jackson was a little off, okay? Not just mentally, but just in general, okay? During that time period, he gives way after 2 terms to a guy named Martin Van Buren. Van Buren from New York basically isn't Jackson. You never want to be the guy that follows greatness, as I've said all the time. Who wants to be the guy that follows Tom Brady in New England? As we're seeing, it's not exactly a good fit. It's a little rough, okay? The Packers are going to find out real quick if Jordan Love is going to live up to the hype. But how would you like to be Jordan Love to follow Aaron Rodgers? Especially if he doesn't come back after a MVP season. So it's tough to follow. No pressure at all, Van Buren loses re-election because nobody really likes him, and he loses to a guy named William Henry Harrison, who has the distinction of being a footnote in history because he only lived 31 days. He's then replaced by Tyler, who allows Texas to become a state. Okay, Tyler is replaced by Polk, who fights the Mexican War. Not him personally, but that's when the Mexican War happens. And so far, we've gone through Unit 2, Unit 3, and Unit 4. Your basic timelines. Obviously, a lot more happened. Keep in mind, Unit 4 is called the Antebellum. Unit 3 is basically Revolution and Republic. We get our independence, and then we get our republic under the Constitution. That's the basic synopsis here. And I know it's getting a little jumbled, and I apologize. I know for you people that like organized things, this must be driving you up the wall, but the best we can do here, okay? Mexican War, of course, gives us California, basically gives us the West Coast, if you will. Polk manages to get his dream of going coast to coast. He's really excited about it, and then he leaves office after one term. Why? He's exhausted. Okay, and he had promised at that point that he was only going to run for one term of office. Okay, he wins the Mexican War. What a high point! He leaves office, lives a couple more years, and then dies. Okay. Polk is the 11th president. He is replaced by a guy named Taylor, old Zachary Taylor, who was a Mexican War hero. He dies and is replaced by Fillmore. Nobody seems to care, including Fillmore's own family. Okay? He then gets replaced in an election. Okay, well, Nehemiah, you need guidance. So Taylor and Fillmore. Fillmore is then replaced in an election by Franklin Pierce. Nobody seems to like him, so they replace him with James Buchanan. Nobody seems to like him, and then they have the controversial election of 1860, which results in who? 1860. Lincoln. Okay? Because this is when we fight the Civil War. 1861 to 1865 is the Civil War. How'd we get there? Remember this part right here, ever since the Mexican War, we have a question of what to do with the Western Territory. So we have the Compromise of 1850. We have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We have Dred Scott decision. We have John Brown. All of that happens before Lincoln comes into office. This time period right in here is crazy. We are sectionalizing. We are becoming separate, North versus South, all throughout that. Lincoln is just the final culminating blast, if you will. Okay, Lincoln's the last straw. Is it him personally? No, the Southerners don't care. You know, Lincoln, they may not like him at all, but they're not sitting there going, oh man, what a terrible human being, the worst person we could possibly. It's what he stands for. He stands for anti-slavery. He stands for Northern values. He stands for Republican values, the new third party that all of a sudden has replaced the Whigs. And he doesn't even appear on the ballot in most of the South. So that, according to them, he's not their president. Okay? And so they start fighting. Okay? The flood's going to start here in a second. Yes. worry. Noah will be buying a bit with his ark. It'll be fine. For those of you that aren't believers in that biblical story, you're going to find out here in a little bit if it's true. All right. So that time period again, and by this point we're up to Unit 5, is the Civil War and Reconstruction. Technically this unit stretches to 1877, because 1877 is when we have the Compromise of 1877, which ends Reconstruction. 1865, Lincoln is assassinated. But in 1865, the Civil War comes to an end. We then transition into Reconstruction. And during Reconstruction, keep in mind, the Civil War amendments are passed. And that is 13 through 15. 13 is abolition of slavery. 14 is citizenship for former slaves and equal protection under the law. And 15 is suffrage, which means voting rights for former slaves, at least former male slaves. Females, you gotta wait. All that happens during Reconstruction. Now, it's not perfect, of course. Reconstruction has its flaws. You, of course, have Andrew Johnson take over momentarily. Okay? He is the first one impeached, mostly because he's not Lincoln. He's replaced in an election by U.S. Grant, who basically serves out the rest of this. Okay? Grant serves all the way up until the Compromise of 1877. Why? A guy named Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president because of that Compromise of 1877. Okay? He becomes the 19th president, and the South gets to end Reconstruction. The worst deal ever. If you're African American, this is the worst deal in American history. Because the Republicans got Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House, and the Southerners got to impose Jim Crow laws because nobody was there to stop it. It's a pretty terrible deal. All right? Hayes only serves one term. He is replaced by Garfield, who's assassinated, who then gives way to Chester A. Arthur because of that assassination. Then you have Grover Cleveland. He's no good. So then you have Benjamin Harrison. He's no good. Then you end up with Cleveland again, which then brings into existence William McKinley. Who is president at the turn of the century, as we start coming into the 1900s. Okay? During this time period right here, this is where you have the Industrial Revolution. But you also have the Gilded Age. So yes, people are making money, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, you name it, but their workers aren't making anything. Okay? The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. It's a disaster across the board. And so now, if you've got all that problem, you've got all these issues, you have a new turn-of-the-century issue. As you start to grow industrially, you are then going to have the desire to get more natural resources. So you're going to maybe go for imperialism. But this corruption needs to stop, so the same people that are pushing for imperialism are trying to progress past this corruption into an age of progressivism. You may remember that McKinley doesn't exactly get to serve out his entire term. McKinley is killed, but it's, of course, not before he wins the Spanish-American War. Okay, the Spanish-American War happens in 1898. That establishes the United States as an imperial nation. McKinley also starts to try and make some changes, but is murdered before he can get started. That paves the way for Teddy Roosevelt to take over. Teddy Roosevelt gives way to Taft after the remaining part of his second term, and Taft then gives way to Wilson. These are your progressive and imperial presidents. You can throw McKinley in there if you want. I personally do, but the AP board tends to only worry about the three, TR, Taft, and Wilson. If you remember during Wilson's time in office, that was World War I. He gives us the 14 points, in which he tries desperately to show us that this is the way to solve the problems of World War I. We don't listen, so naturally we're going to have World War II. Okay? After Wilson is the Roaring Twenties, and in the Roaring Twenties, you have a hodgepodge of presidents that really don't matter all that much. You have Harding, who dies in office, Coolidge, who has a huge impact upon the economy, and Hoover, who kind of guide us through the Roaring Twenties. As you know, the Roaring Twenties basically grind to a halt because of the stock market crash and the ensuing bank failures and unemployment rates, which paves the way for the longest serving president we ever had, FDR. FDR serves from 1933 to his death in 1945. And of course, he guides us through the Great Depression, he gives us the New Deal, and he guides us through World War II. The war so nice we fought it twice. This section right here is Unit 6 back here, Unit 6, which is basically industrialization, and Unit 7, which is America between the wars. So we're talking about the wars. World War I and World War II. They're, of course, also talking about the Spanish-American War as well. Okay? Which leads us to good old Unit 8. Unit 8 is the Cold War. After FDR, Truman takes over. He's followed by Eisenhower, who is then replaced by JFK, then replaced by LBJ, then Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and George W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, I should say. Okay? Truman, of course, starts off the Cold War. His version of fighting the Cold War is to establish what is known as containment policy. And he bolsters that through the use of the Marshall Plan. You keep communism where it lives, and you support those that are not communist. Which means we support a ton of dictators during the Cold War. Of course, during that time period, all we're trying to do is fight the communists, especially the Soviet Union. Eisenhower tries to cool things down a little bit during his time in office. He focuses way more on internal problems, but he has a lot of internal problems because this is when the civil rights movement is, which stretches on to and through, at least the modern day civil rights movement, to and through JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and beyond. Okay? But Eisenhower also has to deal with a number of other things. His major contribution is the interstate highway system. Okay? But he has some other things obviously going through, and you guys went and did the work on Eisenhower against Truman here. Both of them pretty consequential presidents in the early stages of the Cold War. JFK comes in, of course. We've already talked about these modern day presidents. He has to deal with the civil rights movement as well. He has to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis, amongst other things. He doesn't get to complete his term because of the assassination. LBJ takes over. LBJ, of course, also has to deal with the civil rights movement, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. Nixon then takes over after him, kind of goes the opposite direction on that. Instituting a number of things like the Southern Strategy and other things to try and bring law and order to the United States. He unceremoniously leaves office because of the scandal in Watergate. Ford and Carter then kind of clean up that mess, but don't ever really get to have a presidency of their own because of a whole host of other issues. Reagan takes over for 8 years during the 1980s. Bush kind of is a continuation of Reagan for another 4 years, which then gets us into the modern age. Which the modern age is Unit 9, which is barely on the test. Okay? So modern America, barely on the test. That's where you have Clinton, George W. Bush, you have Obama, Trump, and Biden, who will not be on the test. Nor will Trump, for that matter. At least they shouldn't be. That's what they tell us. Okay? Modern presidents tend to end with probably Clinton, to be honest with you. They might include a question about George W. Bush, but when they say modern America, usually they end in George W. Bush's term of office. Okay? So that's a basic rundown of a timeline. Okay? The reason that I put all this stuff up here is if you can remember a few categories of things, you know, I'm doing all the presidents from memory. Okay? I don't expect you to do the same thing. Okay? I don't expect you to go home and memorize the presidents and when they served. But if you can memorize little things like, all right, I know that Madison and Monroe were before Jackson. You know, and you can categorize, okay, this question is about Jacksonian politics. I know that these guys were before them and these guys were after them. That helps you to remember when things are. Okay? If I know that imperialism is Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, and I don't know that Lincoln was before that, that helps me to remember the Civil War was before the Spanish-American War. Okay? Or World War I, for that matter. Okay? It's just, if you can remember just kind of key presidencies, you don't have to remember Zachary Taylor. Nobody cares. Okay? But you do have to kind of remember when things happen. If they ask a question about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, if you can just remember, okay, that was before the Civil War. That was sectionalism. Okay, so they're starting to tear things apart. I got it. You're just kind of encapsulating when things are roughly. And you'll notice I'm not like harping on specific dates here. It's just a kind of, can you remember where it is sort of in the timeline of American history? It doesn't have to be too specific for you to at least kind of understand when things occur and when things happen. Okay? All right, I'm going to end the video because that's getting a little too long.